After the previous episodes, you probably know very well what the Court of the Dead was like in ancient Egypt, and you know that they used a feather to weigh the heart of the deceased. But what was that feather? Believe it or not, the ancient Egyptians themselves never left us a sentence saying, "We used a feather because." And that's where the mystery begins. To understand the feather, we first have to understand Ma'at, right? Now here's something fascinating. Ma'at wasn't simply a goddess. She was also much more than that. She represented truth, justice, balance, harmony, the proper order of the universe. In other words, everything that kept creation from falling into chaos. Ancient Egyptians believed the universe wasn't naturally stable. Every day, order had to overcome disorder. Every sunrise was another victory of order over chaos. And Ma'at was the very principle that made that possible. Even the gods lived according to Ma'at. Even the king, the pharaoh, was expected to protect Ma'at. So Ma'at wasn't just a religion. It was the foundation of existence itself. Now here's where the feather comes in. If you look at almost every ancient image of Ma'at, she wears something very unusual. A single ostrich feather on her head. Not an eagle feather, not a falcon feather, an ostrich feather. Over time, that feather became so closely connected with Ma'at that artists didn't even need to draw the goddess anymore. Sometimes they simply drew the feather, and everyone knew exactly what it meant. The feather itself had become the symbol of Ma'at. Almost like how today, a dove can symbolize peace, or scales can symbolize justice. The feather had become the visual language of truth and cosmic order. But then comes the obvious question. Why an ostrich feather? And here's something very important. No surviving Egyptian text ever explains why this particular feather was chosen. Not one. So if you hear someone confidently saying, "The Egyptians chose it because," be careful. They're probably giving you an interpretation, not an ancient explanation. Modern Egyptologists have proposed several ideas, but they make an important distinction between evidence and interpretation. One idea is especially popular among scholars. If you've ever looked closely at an ostrich feather, you'll notice something remarkable. Its two sides are unusually balanced, almost mirror images of each other. For the Egyptians, balance wasn't just beautiful. Balance was sacred. Symmetry was one expression of order, and order was Ma'at. Now, does that prove this is why the feather was chosen? No, we can't prove that. But many scholars believe the feather's remarkable symmetry may have made it a fitting symbol for cosmic balance. It's a careful interpretation, not a documented fact, and that's an important difference. There's another misunderstanding we should clear up. People often say, the feather represents being light. Not exactly. Remember, the Egyptians knew perfectly well that a human heart weighs much more than a feather. This wasn't a physical science experiment. It was never about grams. The balance wasn't measuring mass. It was measuring something much deeper. Whether your life had remained in harmony with Ma'at, whether your actions reflected truth or disorder, whether your heart still belonged to the world the gods had created. That's why the feather wasn't chosen because it was light. It was chosen because it represented Ma'at herself. In many religious scenes, the feather actually stands in place of the goddess. It's almost as if Ma'at herself is sitting on one side of the balance, without needing to appear there in human form. One small feather representing one of the greatest ideas in all of Egyptian religion. That's why the feather wasn't chosen because it was light. It was chosen because it represented Ma'at herself. In many religious scenes, the feather actually stands in place of the goddess. It's almost as if Ma'at herself is sitting on one side of the balance without needing to appear there in human form. One small feather, representing one of the greatest ideas in all of Egyptian religion. And then another question appears. If the feather represents truth, why isn't the brain weighed? Why the heart? That answer is even more surprising. So, if the feather represented Ma'at, why wasn't the brain placed on the scales? Why the heart? Because for the ancient Egyptians, the heart wasn't just an organ. It was you. Today we think with our brains. We believe our memories, emotions, and personality all live inside our heads. But the ancient Egyptians saw things very differently. To them, your heart remembered. Your heart made decisions. Your heart knew the difference between right and wrong. Your heart carried your memories. Even your conscience lived there. That's why during mummification, the brain was usually removed, but the heart was almost always left inside the body, because one day it would have to speak for you, not with words, but with its own truth. Now here's one of the biggest myths on the internet. People often say, your heart had to be lighter than the feather. Actually, that's not what the ancient texts say. The Book of the Dead never explains the judgment in terms of physical weight. The balance is symbolic. What matters is whether the heart is in harmony with Ma'at. The image isn't teaching physics, it's teaching morality. A heart burdened by lies, injustice, or violence is shown as being out of balance with truth. The message is ethical, not mechanical. And that's why the famous spell known today as Spell 30B is so important. Before the weighing begins, the deceased speaks directly to their own heart, almost like talking to an old friend. They say, "Do not stand against me as a witness. Do not betray me before the tribunal." Imagine that. The Egyptians believed your own heart knew everything you'd ever done. You could lie to another person, you could fool a judge, but you couldn't fool your own heart, because it had been with you your entire life. You can watch the full video of this spell in our previous episodes. Please subscribe to us, friends. So, why a feather? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly why the ancient Egyptians first chose an ostrich feather. No surviving text tells us. But we do know this. The feather became the symbol of Ma'at. And Ma'at was far more than a goddess. She was the principle that held the universe together. Truth, justice, balance, order. The heart wasn't trying to become physically lighter than a feather. It was being measured against one of the greatest ideals the Egyptians could imagine. Could your life stand beside truth itself? That was the real question. And maybe that's why this scene still fascinates us today, because thousands of years later, the question hasn't really changed. If your own heart were placed on the scales, not your money, not your job, not your fame, just your choices, would it still be in balance? Maybe that's why the feather of Ma'at has survived for thousands of years, not because it was beautiful, but because it asked a question that every generation still has to answer. If you enjoyed this journey into ancient Egypt, there's so much more waiting for you on Art.Timeline. Every week we explore the myths, symbols, and masterpieces of the ancient world, always based on academic research, museum collections, and Egyptological scholarship. Because the more you understand the history of art, the more charismatic your perspective becomes. And every episode is another peaceful journey through one of the greatest civilizations humanity has ever known.